Okay, morning everyone. Take you can see my screen, Dan?
Yes, looks good.
Perfect, right, okay, so the purpose of today's webinar is really to take you through how you can really take advantage of a lot of the Microsoft technologies out there. One technology in particular that we just want to kind of bring onto your radar, and perhaps you've already had a look at and thought about, is the Microsoft Managed Desktop offering that Microsoft have announced. But what we want to do is really, it's twofold, and we've got Core, who we work with, a Microsoft Gold partner, that we work very closely with, who will be taking you through an alternative to this Microsoft Managed Desktop, and we'll really want to highlight the reasons why that's something of a possibility for you to consider as part of this presentation. Just to really take you through the Microsoft dream, so to speak. I mean, what Microsoft are really doing in the concepts that they're basing their roadmap on is to really give this, I suppose, this consumer promise to your end users, that it's a lot easier to consume any device or applications that you provision to them, to make it easier for them to consume and easier for them to almost self-service and have a concept where there's very limited amount of interaction with the IT teams like has traditionally been done. And the reason Microsoft are really going down this route is to, as you can see on the right hand side, try and help lower your own total cost of ownership. You have less on-prem infrastructure costs because it's a cloud focused technology. You have the ability to not have to worry about those imaging and deployment mechanisms that you've traditionally had set up within your IT teams. Now it's all sort of self-service and something that can be managed, almost look after itself, so to speak. And this is what the promises of modern management is from Microsoft. Now the solution is all based on technologies that you've no doubt heard of. So it's based on their technology stack, which includes Microsoft Intune, Autopilot, Microsoft ATP, and the Azure Active Directory in the cloud technologies that we're all kind of familiar with. And anyone who's perhaps looked into Microsoft M365 will be familiar with all of those technologies that are available. And Microsoft have announced a service. It's called Microsoft Managed Desktop, and it's really made up of the three main components here: Microsoft Intune, Autopilot, and that ATP. But the whole point of the Microsoft Managed Desktop is that it's not just those technologies as a kind of service for you to utilize for yourself. It's a service that Microsoft will run and manage on your behalf. So you have the investment already as part of the license agreement that perhaps you've got with M365, but then Microsoft can take on the ownership of how you run that to your end users as a service for itself. Now, just to give you a very brief breakdown of how the whole solution works. I mean, from an IT admin's point of view, you would have an investment in Intune, where you can set up, configure profiles that then synchronize with Windows Autopilot. And the whole point of it is that you would then be able to define, by going direct to a hardware vendor, a number of device IDs from that hardware vendor, so that when you purchase any of those hardware devices, they auto attach those device IDs to that hardware. And instead of the hardware then being shipped to you as an IT admin, the hardware is actually shipped direct to the employee. And when the employee unboxes that device, it self-service deploys all of the applications and all of the management, all the profile and everything that you've already configured via Intune. So the whole point is that it makes it very, very simple, very easy, very easier to manage and easier to deploy. And as you can see, there has been this no interaction between the IT admin and the employee. It's all been self-served directly from the factory. So that's the concept behind this, and what the Microsoft Managed Desktop solution really does is owns that as a service for you. So you can essentially say, well, this is the configuration I want, this is the profile that I want, this is how I want the image to look, but you won't actually own and manage any of the stuff on the left-hand side. That will all be dealt with by Microsoft. Microsoft will own and manage that whole process for you. And essentially, that's something that you then can just sit back and you can worry about other things within your business. That's the idea behind the Microsoft Managed Desktop. Why is this different now? Well, directory services have moved to the cloud for Microsoft. There's a lot more intuitive technology that's in place with Windows 10. It's now based on a different BIOS. You can do in-place upgrades with Windows 10. There's no version control differences between the versions of operating system they have compared to how it used to be. There's a lot of code management that they've got in place that's allowing us to be able to do all of this desktop technology compared to how it used to be. And in terms of what your desktop options are, these are the options that you would be able to have in terms of how you can manage this end to end. So you could have this set up as a configuration, this Intune Windows Autopilot, but you could completely manage it yourself. So you could enroll the devices into Intune yourself and run Autopilot yourself and do that whole configuration piece as an IT admin, but that would still involve the device being shipped to you. And these are, I suppose, the options that you have. You can kind of do very much a manual deployment, or you can do some kind of hybrid version where it's you know, you would configure and manage it, but perhaps use Autopilot to do that deployment direct to the end user. Where Microsoft Managed Desktop sits is very much this version on the right-hand side. It's a kind of like a pre-provisioned configuration that's ready for a business to be able to take advantage of. But I just want to take you through some of the steps and some of the reasons why Microsoft Managed Desktop is good, but some of the things that perhaps you wouldn't be aware of necessarily. So just to give you a few of the facts, yes, it is based on great technology as a start. It's got all the Autopilot, Intune, ATP, and features of M365. That's the great technology that Microsoft have got behind this engine. But a few facts that you need to be aware of is that it's a 500 to 1,000 seat minimum. So if you wanted to take advantage of this, you'd need to take a IT as a service additional license on top of that M365 license. And that would be the way that you'd be able to take advantage of the MMD service first of all. Microsoft only approve a certain amount of applications. So if you have applications that are not supported by Microsoft, fall outside of that list of supported applications, it cannot be included in this service. And that's something that you need to be aware of. Windows Defender is the only option for endpoint security. So if you're currently using a different vendor for your endpoint security, and a lot of people do that for good reasons too, be aware of that Microsoft won't be able to support that. And that's something that's very, very significant. There's only a specific list of devices that are supported by the MMD service, so you wouldn't be able to onboard necessarily into this service existing devices that you've got deployed out there, because they might fall out of that list of devices. And if you are QAing some new devices perhaps for a rollout, you'd need to make sure that that device that you're QAing falls inside of that supported list of devices that Microsoft support. One thing that's quite significant as well, it's a cloud-only solution. So if you do currently have SCCM, for instance, and you wanted to do that code management, Microsoft wouldn't support that. There'd only be a cloud-only deployment. And that is something that's something you need to be aware of. This is cloud only. It's not going to integrate with what you've got as an existing rollout. And funnily enough, also one of the things that's worth understanding is that Microsoft also partner with a number of service providers to provide this service. So when you perhaps think that this is a service that's being provided by Microsoft, actually it's not. Microsoft will handle the billing, and obviously it's the technologies behind the stack, but a lot of the service gets partnered off to Microsoft's partners and not direct with Microsoft, as you might assume. So just a few things that you need to be aware of with regards to Microsoft Managed Desktop. Yes, it's based on great technology, but there are some limitations to it that it is worth understanding. Just in terms of what the requirements are from a technology point of view, you'd need to have those applications on Windows 10, you'd need to have an Azure subscription, Azure AD, and that network needs to be configured in order to provide that home connectivity to home resources. Microsoft wouldn't set that up for you. You'd need to have all of that already in place in order for that service to work cleanly. In terms of licenses, it's not just a case of having Microsoft 365. You need to also have AD Premium P2 and that IT as a service additional add-on license in order to take advantage of this service. So it's a very good service in terms of the technology stack, and we wanted to make that clear that Microsoft have done an incredible amount of work in order to make sure this is a process and a configuration that really works well for that auto deployment. No doubt about it, Intune, Autopilot, ATP, they're great technologies, but as you might be able to have recognized, there are some limitations to it. So there's very much a twofold message we've got from today's webinar, in that we just wanted to highlight the good technology that this is, but we also wanted to present to you Bytes' alternative in terms of why you should consider this. Because if you are looking at this option for Microsoft, the Microsoft Managed Desktop, it's worth considering this as an alternative. Because what is Bytes Managed Workplace? Well, it is exactly the same as what Microsoft are offering, but it's just not Microsoft Managed Desktop. So it is based on the Microsoft technology stack, Intune, Autopilot, ATP, etc. It's got all of those enhanced security features that we've discussed, part of ATP. But the difference is it's a lot more flexible. So you've got that device freedom of choice. There isn't a limited device list that we need you to adhere to. There isn't a limited application stack that you need to adhere to. There isn't an endpoint security limitation. We're not going to force you to use Windows Defender, for instance. So all of those limitations that Microsoft got in place, you're completely free of that. It's completely flexible. We have got the capability of being able to support that hybrid configuration, for instance. So if you've got an existing SCCM deployment, we can completely integrate that with this solution to support that end-to-end deployment for you. It's got all of the features that Microsoft have got, that technology, but it gives you a lot more flexibility, and then it's got that focus that you need, that monitoring, the alerting, the patching, the updating, UK-based service desk. You know who you're working with. You're not going to be partnered off with someone who you're not familiar with that Microsoft will do on your behalf. This is a safe set of hands, so to speak. So in terms of why this would be something that you as a business would consider overall, well, it's the same reasons that Microsoft are presenting in terms of total cost of ownership. It means that you no longer have to worry about all of that infrastructure on-prem. You've got the capabilities of not having to worry about image management, desktop management, application, desktop deployment, all of that kind of focus that your IT teams perhaps currently have to focus on and is quite a difficulty in this current climate, is completely taken away from you, and now you can focus on other more strategic innovations within your business. That's the idea behind it, but I am aware that you might have some difficulty justifying this to your business. There is ways that we can work with you in order to make that cost analysis and go through that justification. But as I said before, we work with a Microsoft Gold partner, Core Technologies, who are able to provide this as a service. But what I'm going to do now is hand over to Hannah Newman, and Eamon McGann, who will be able to take you through a day in the life scenarios of how you might be able to justify this as something that you see as an area of focus within your business. So Hannah, over to you.
Great. So hi everyone there. So my name's Hannah. As Peter mentioned, I work for one of Bytes partners called Core. Today, from the Core perspective, I'll also be joined by my colleague Eamon. I don't know if Eamon, if you want to say a little hello.
Good morning all. As Hannah said, my name is Eamon McGann. I'm the Solutions Director at Core, and I look forward to going through the session with you guys.
Perfect. Well, and Peter greatly said, what we're going to do today is we're going to run through what a day in a life looks like, how the Bytes modern workplace, or how we kind of acronym it to BMW. No, it's not the car brand. The similarity is great, so it's one to remember. But so if you do hear BMW, that is actually the Bytes modern workplace. But then, Aim, if you want to pop the slides up on screen.
Yeah, Danny, do you mind handing me control? There we go. Okay, just give me 2 seconds, Hannah. Okay, Hannah, she should see those now.
Great, perfect. So yeah, as I mentioned, we're going to start off by just running what does a day in a life for a desktop technician actually look like? So what kind of challenges and what kind of BAU or business as usual tasks do you need to run through to ensure that your kind of desktops are kind of up to scratch? So start off with, although they're quite mundane, we've got to make sure that the devices are upgraded, all the patching is up to date, just to make sure that the device is secure. When considering security, this leads into, you might have actual internal policies that you're abiding by, but depending on the industry you're in, you might also have to abide some industry standards that are kind of pushed onto your organization. One thing that Microsoft do like to do is they change things around quite a lot. So it's always keeping up to date with what's the latest technology, what's the kind of best practices that need to be followed. Obviously, that takes up quite a lot of time and resource on your own internal team to make sure they're upskilled and that they're actually deploying the best management methodology. And also just, I suppose, a fun fact, if I call it fun, the highest ticket volume that actually crosses a service desk is based on desktop. So you hire a kind of a great team of technicians, engineers, and they end up doing not the exciting things they enjoy doing, but maybe the more kind of mundane BAU tasks that detract from actually being able to innovate and actually improve the system, but making sure that the kind of things that could be outsourced as their focus of their time, really. So, but you all know what you do, kind of a day in life of your own job. Really is, why does BMW, why have we actually brought this solution together? Why have Bytes and Core come together? Well, we've identified 5 categories of the benefits that it can provide for your organization. So first of all, it is user satisfaction. As part of the service, we do regular surveys to make sure that, to kind of check how people are doing. So it's great, it's increasing user satisfaction. From a productivity point of view, the devices are up to date, collaboration's being quicker, people are getting things more done. In the world now where everyone's remote, you really need this kind of productive working laptop. Security and compliance, so ensuring that whether it be internal or actual industry standards are met, so we can work with you to ensure that that is the case. Management, looking at management, it's great, it's simplified, it's unified, you don't have lots of different devices where there's a little bit of chaos going on, but there's actually a bit of standardization across the estate. And one that a lot of the CFOs like, as with kind of the way the world's working now with your Netflix, your Amazon Prime, it's predictable billing. It's a subscription based per user per month. So being able to manage cost over a yearly basis is actually a lot more great. So these are kind of the 5 high categories. I'm actually going to hand over to Eamon, who is going to run into a bit more detail around those categories and actually show you some real life scenarios that we've done working with customers. So Eamon, I'll hand over to you if that's okay.
Thanks, Hannah. So slides on. So as Hannah said, she's outlined some of the key opportunities, or maybe you could even say some of the problems that we're addressing and trying to solve with BMW. And again, I'm going to use the BMW phrase quite a lot over the next wee while. So again, we're referring to the Bytes managed workspace. So for the next wee while, I'm going to, in effect, take each of the categories and we'll start with user satisfaction. And we're going to talk about some practical use cases in the life of these things in action. And we're going to repeat that for each of the 5. The first and primary problem and use case we look at is user satisfaction. A happy and, where appropriate, self-sufficient user is typically more productive and, frankly, less costly. And I think cost is one of the key things here. With BMW, one of our key goals is to reduce IT costs reduce costs on first and second line type activity in particular. And this is really around a stable and self-service based operating model. So BMW really is fundamentally about creating device builds and management conditions to achieve the top user satisfaction we're trying to look for. If we kind of break it into a little bit of detail, firstly, BMW is based on a cloud-first seamless remote working principle. And this helps bypass a number of the ongoing and traditional painful legacy type issues we see. One of them, for example, being VPN connectivity. I know working in some of our customers in public sector and NHS, it is a constant pain point about VPN connectivity, lost connectivity, and some of the issues. So one of the first key things we build into BMW is always on VPN. Now there is other solutions, and Peter talked about one of the key things we want to be with the BMW service is flexible, but where we can create standards, our builds come with all of these capabilities built in. And that's really about helping reduce frustration. User frustration really does for us cut across a number of key levels. So I think as part of the BMW service, a core set of strategies around how do we reduce user frustration. And first and foremost, password management is probably one of the biggest issues we see out there. You know, it's a significant issue in terms of data breaches and user frustration. So one of the key parts of our service is the introduction of self-service password reset. And we feel that has a very significant impact on the service. Forrester suggests that SSPO, or self-service password reset, reduces help desk calls by as much as 20%. We've seen that even higher. And over time, if not initially, we aim to on the service move our customers to completely passwordless. And we've seen massive increases, particularly over the last few months, in the number of users that use passwordless across the Microsoft network. Device reliability is cornerstone of the product, and I'll come back to this a few times, and it is really a key issue for user frustration. BMW is fundamentally around standardized builds across all of our customers, ensuring that we've got a much more responsive desktop, faster boot times, less blue screens, and I think the key thing is proactive remediation. Let's fix it before the user even knows. So it's a much more proactive approach to support, and a result, hopefully a happy user. And it's not just assuming they're happy, let's monitor and manage this. And this is something that Hannah touched on. We use Net Promoter Score to review user satisfaction, and improved satisfaction we know ultimately leads to better employee engagement. There was a study done a couple of years ago by the US Future Ready Workforce, and the number of kind of key stats in there, but one of the standout stats was that 42% of millennials would suggest they would move environments if the technology that was provided them wasn't up to scratch. And that's quite a significant and in one sense surprising stat that something like that will cause that, but that's kind of some of the things that we're trying to deal with. So for us, this is about a seamless service, a seamless device provisioning service, no delays getting devices out there, and keeping people and users working. And I think one of our key goals with BMW is to actually make IT the hero and not the blocker to innovation. And if we look at that from a day in the life perspective, considering user satisfaction, COVID has really amplified a scenario that's not unique, but is definitely growing. And that's some of the key challenges around the provisioning and managing of devices, in some cases at scale. And we've seen a lot of that over the last 6 months. We actually have a customer, or a number of customers who have to ship devices not only within the UK, but also overseas. And when we look at overseas shipment, you know, there are a number of key risks that with BMW we aim to mitigate. Firstly is delay of things like customs and shipping, and that's got worse recently rather than better. And whilst that's probably mitigatable, one of the key concerns is data integrity and intellectual property security. You know, historically when we ship devices, they come back to base, we do some work on them, and then we ship them out with corporate tools and potentially corporate data. And that really has some significant impact in terms of data integrity and security risk. And we ourselves have some kind of clear experiences of some of the exposure that's caused for our customers. So really using the technologies around being able to send OEM devices directly to source. We actually have a customer who's got a very strong presence in China. It's actually a government agency, and apart from the user risk and the data risk side of things, just we really saw a lot of frustration with users when they weren't able to get devices quickly and efficiently. Just wanted to get on with their work, and they were using tools and mechanisms to get around delays with shipments and so on. So something that we looked at and we looked to address, and we did that with our offering of the Autopilot service, so a little bit like the scenario that Peter alluded to a little bit earlier. And this really is a much enhanced delivery service and a much better user experience. The user gets the device really quickly. It's up and running out of the box in a rapid time frame, in most cases less than an hour, and it's got their apps, their data, and it's ready to go. And this is achieved really in 3 simple but straightforward stages. Firstly, the procurement and distribution is much simpler. So we source locally and we deliver locally where that's appropriate, both throughout the UK and but more importantly internationally where that is needed. The provisioning of apps and data is achieved and done locally. And again, a key point as a comparison to maybe some of the other services, those apps are the complete standard set of apps, but also additional apps as needed. So we're not restricted to just the subset of applications. And then finally, the onward management. And there is a lot to be said about the effort that goes into fixing and refreshing devices where they have to come back to base. So through this automated service and remote service, we do it securely and to diplomatic standards where that's appropriate. And fundamentally, this is all based on a zero-touch deployment and reset approach based on BMW Autopilot. The second area that we look at in terms of kind of benefits or problem areas that we want to make sure we can stay on top of is security and compliance. And we address this, in a number of key ways. And arguably, this is a key focus not only for IT management, but also for the data protection officers and the CISOs within an organization. It's something that as a collective they come together on. So there are a number of key topics we look at under this. And firstly, whilst security compliance is vital, especially current times, there has to be a balance about getting the right level of security compliance out there. And one classic example we see quite often is, particularly in remote working, a desire to get things like multi-factor authentication out there to everybody as a blanket type offering. And BMW really is around taking the enhanced Microsoft 365 security set, be it E3 or E5, and delivering that as appropriate. So for example, when we talk about multi-factor, for our customers of E3, we will enable location-based multi-factor, whereas when they're V5, we'll use some of the additional capability in risk-based. So being able to look at that, or even looking at things like the latest config of spam, phishing, and virus detection. So BMW really is about taking, or based on policies, deploying them quickly and efficiently, but aligning them to your needs. Where you've got non-Microsoft technology, that we're at a minimum making sure that they work well together. We also focus on improved access control. So the BMW service out of the box looks at role-based access, privileged access, and conditional access through advanced identity management. And then finally, when we look at data and compliance protection, which for me personally is the heartbeat. If we're securing a device, really what we're trying to secure is the data and the intellectual property in that device. And this really is the kind of beating heart of zero trust approach to security. BMW will, as part of its config out of the box, configure to the appropriate level of encryption and information governance and help manage the data through its complete life cycle. So there is integration with the wider tenant and integration with the wider environment. We clearly make sure that alerting, reporting, and monitoring is built into the service. And that really gives the flexibility to scale that up and escalate into either your own SIEM service or security service, or as part of our extended offering, the ability for us to run security and SIEM services as well. So we'll take all of that data and export it and make it available real time to security services. And when we, look at it, the kind of 3 things we're trying to do is reduce the risk, improve the compliance, and improve the resilience of the device. So when we look at that from a day in the life perspective, device level security is challenging. Microsoft claimed there's 6 trillion threats being received per day, and this clearly is being exposed even further during COVID and some of the management issues that we're trying to deal with on a day-to-day basis. One pretty startling stat for us as a business, we onboarded a customer in the last 6 months, and one of the things we do as part of our onboarding is we do a security compliance review, and what we detected was during that period an additional 100 devices. External BOIOD non-corporate devices were added to the customer's network, adding accessing corporate resources and creating some serious data compliance issues for the client. So there is a balance to be had here. There's a balance between embracing bring your own device, but also mitigating the risks of bring your own device and things like jailbroken devices, where we fundamentally just don't know the hygiene of the device. And for us, there's a lot of technology built into the BMW stack. So it's kind of a 2-part strategy to how we do this from a day in the life perspective. Firstly, it's a standardized update process to corporately owned devices. So a very clear ongoing basis of patching, managing, and updating and registering the compliance of the device. And that's done on an ongoing basis. And when that's achieved, when we access resources or specific types of resources, so maybe highly sensitive data, financial applications, those kind of key things, we have that extra layer of compliance readiness, and then we get device access as a result of that, or user access, I should say. The second part of the strategy really is about a mature approach to BYOD, so where the responsibility is placed and shared with the user to make sure that their device is up to minimum hygiene standards. And where it doesn't comply to our compliance policy, and that may be something as simple as OS builds needing to be OS version -1, or that a device using an appropriately approved application to access email or a financial application. In these scenarios, if we haven't achieved that, ultimately when the user goes to access the resources or a particular type of resource, we can block that access. So we may still let them in for certain things, but we can block them on a conditional basis. So BMW really achieves this in a number of ways. Firstly, the implementation and ongoing management of the device itself and of the policy of the device. And then secondly, management and implementation and ongoing management of the condition access policies. And it's very important that we look at device and condition access in one scenario. The third issue and third area we look at is predictable billing. And I think, this is, and I mentioned it earlier, this is clearly something that the financial members of the leadership team will look at. What benefit are we getting from our device, our device estate? One of the things we see quite often is the variation of cost for services and licenses can be a considerable challenge. And as a result of that, one of the cornerstones and one of the things we've embedded from the get-go as part of the fabric of BMW is predictable billing. And this really does this in a number of key ways. Firstly, predictable monthly costs, no hidden fees. We like to avoid what we refer to as bill shock. It wastes everybody's time having lots of phone calls about what's this on the bill. So bill shock is something we try and manage from the outset. Part of doing that is about information. So integrated single vendor billing for all of the things that sit under the device umbrella. So licensing, hardware, and the device management delivered as the BMW service. So making it much easier to understand your total device management costs at every stage of the device life cycle in one simple dashboard, one simple area to see this. I think speaking to customers, one of the key things that customers want to do, and again, this is highlighted over the previous months, is have flexibility. Needs do fluctuate. So BMW is built on the premise of being able to scale up and down as needed and manage those costs as needed. And then I think one of the key things for us, and Hannah and Peter both alluded to this a little bit earlier, is in needing to acknowledge and recognize the return on investment that is achievable through liberating some of the IT resources from a couple of things, from standard day-to-day business as usual activity, but also a reduction in business as usual activity through automated processes. So resulting where appropriate in an unlocking of time and capability, and being able to direct that time towards line of business innovation and really driving the business forward. And from a cost management perspective, I think one of the key things that we really think is key as part of the service is making sure we understand and maximize utilization of the wider product set. So where we have third-party software that is over-duplicated and maybe historically needed, BMW and the wider M365 stack allows us to look at the Win10 license estate and the Microsoft license estate and rationalize costs. And again, from a predictable billing and from an overall cost perspective, that's something that we achieve on an ongoing basis as part of the service. So how do we see that kind of an operation from a day-to-day perspective, and one of the key things that maybe stands out as part of that? So firstly, predictable billing. One of the key things we think is vital as part of predictable billing is a well-run JML process, or joiners, movers, leavers process. Cores, the BMW JML process really will look at standard day-to-day joiners, movers, leaver activity as part of the built-in process, but we also support larger transition activities where we're onboarding and offboarding, for example, in retail due to seasonal, and unfortunately things like offboarding due to furloughing and so on that we've seen in the last kind of 6 months or so. So it's really around being able to manage that process as efficiently as possible. And it does this in a number of key ways, and we try to apply a number of key principles to it. So firstly, as part of the JML process, as I said, a standardized security and permissioning builds. We had an instance with the BMW service where, as part of the onboarding with a customer, who shall also remain nameless, across the 700 users, we established that 230 of those users had some form of domain level access. So one of the key drivers as part of the JML process for BMW is the implementation of least privilege model, so role-based access and policy-driven, making them much easier to manage distinct roles and much easier to manage in general. We also, as part of JML, have a license management module which ultimately reports on licensing and automates tenant-level remediation where that's needed. And I think finally, as part of JML, really what we've swallowed when we've used the service is not so much the automation, which is a key part of it, but also some of the behavioral change. So we move away from ad hoc, risky JML type activity, and ultimately IT management and leadership have a much better view of the assets, the licenses, and a much better view of kind of overall cost governance. Okay, so the next area we want to look at is productivity, and one of kind of the benefits and some of the challenges. And I have to say, when we talk to customers, rarely do we start a conversation around what device management, or certainly it doesn't start as the only conversation about what's the best way to do device management. It may well be the outcome. I think a lot of our conversations tend to be, particularly of late, they're focused around line of business managers, be they marketing managers, operational managers, trying to understand the best approach, to get the best applications out there to improve productivity, remote working, and also not to forget about keeping people happy, giving them the right type of experience. So productivity is kind of one of the key things we look at. And BMW is looking to try and achieve that in a number of kind of key ways. Firstly, by ensuring a better and seamless user experience across multiple device types. We really do need to support as many device types and many device scenarios. Core work in both the public sector and commercial sector, but if we just pick up, for example, in the education sector in the last few weeks alone, and even prior to Christmas, we definitely saw an explosion of the need to get lots of different devices onto the environments, iPads, mobiles, all kind of key things, and these are critical for attendance management and learning resources. We need to have an advanced policy to allow that in and manage that in a sensible way. So allowing multiple devices to be part of that is kind of a key issue. We also recognize the need to achieve this by having a remote first approach. So BYOD being part of that. And then standard and stabilized builds. We've got to ensure that we faster blue times, less blue screen, and more time working rather than waiting. And user satisfaction is a key part of that. And one of the key things we do as part of BMW is a before and after measurement of that. So as we stabilize the builds, really what we're trying to achieve is let's ensure that the improved performance, the improved satisfaction is measurable, so we can see that actually we've delivered on the service we expected to. Remote build also supports a number of productivity in ways, and we've touched about Autopilot earlier. So we use Autopilot to do remote build and to get people operational, but a byproduct of remote build is also the ability for us to solve other issues. For example, through the BMW service, we don't try and get caught in complex long-term issues on a device. If a device is faulty, if there's an issue with it, and we'll use a remote capability to often wipe that device, redeploy it, and get it up and running in much quicker, much faster, and the user has much less interruption. We also use that as a major pillar of supporting against ransomware. So an ability not to worry about ransomware, but use the overall service to get a user's operation very quickly should that happen. Clearly, we want to protect in the first instance, but should it happen, we can use the capability to get users operational very, very quickly. And that's a key part of the service. We've kind of touched on this one before, but BMW really is around keeping things current and patched at all times. And that's kind of one of the key things we look at, that the latest patching, the latest productivity apps are up to date. And finally, it's a subtle point, but I think it's an important point in current times, is battery life, keeping the device optimized, keeping the battery life optimized. And we definitely work in a scenario where not everybody now has the luxury of a stable working environment. People have to move around, kitchen tables. We've probably all seen variations of that. And nobody wants to be able to walking around carrying power supplies and so on. So the ability to allow flexibility and keep that battery alive as long as possible may be subtle, but I think it's a good part of both productivity and the user satisfaction that is a given as part of the BMW service. And if we look at that and look at some of the situations around productivity, maybe historically, and a day in the life of what we're trying to achieve with BMW is a very traditional approach to device build would have been the gold image, where we take the manufacturer's build, effectively strip it down, rebuild it back up again based on our build, and something to build something we call a gold image. And when you think about it, that's somewhat setting up to fail. We're taking something that's potentially stable and optimized from a driver perspective from the manufacturer and rebuilding it. And I think what we've seen historically is that kind of leads to a whole set of issues. First and foremost, potentially unstable builds with regular app crashes and slow performance. And whilst those are probably ongoing issues, the thing that concerns us the most around the environments, and we see this quite often, is a hesitance to patch. Once we've stabilized, or once an IT team has stabilized a build, it's let's not mess with it, let's keep it there. And we have seen firsthand and got involved with customers where, due to out-of-date patching on servers and so on, we've got some fairly serious security breaches and so on. So we want to try and get ahead of that and change the culture around being much more proactive on that. And fundamentally, we achieve this in a number of key ways. Firstly, Autopilot, which we've talked a lot about today, and Peter's given an update on, which is optimizing and taking the OEM build under management. But then on an ongoing basis, having a tiered approach to ongoing patching and app management. So where appropriate, we'll use Windows Update for Business for direct patching. And we'll also use Endpoint Manager to support Intelligent Edge for domain joined devices and Intelligent Cloud for cloud joined devices. And this gives us quite a layered approach to device management, to patch management, I should say. Sorry. So, as often as 4 times a month where that's appropriate. One of the things we do is we test at scale. So we test patches as they come in across all our estates. So we're looking for not only existing customers, but across our complete customer base. And we're able to deploy these patches in rings for security and reliability. Much more stable patching, but also where we need to, the ability to pull those patches back, roll them back if we need to. And I think finally, in terms of productivity, BMW really supports a clear and structured app lifecycle management approach. So published apps, managed apps as part of the tenant, a structured and testing deployment. Again, we do that at scale across apps. So apps that are made available, and again, Peter touched on this earlier, so apps that are made available across the complete BMW service are available to all our customers. So new apps that we add, we'll publish and make available so customers can put them on to and make sure that they're stable builds. And then we look at ongoing patching and protection. And then finally, the automated removal of both the software, the licensing, and the device as part of the ongoing JML process. So keep that as a very integrated end-to-end. It's secure and it's cost managed where that's appropriate. The final area that I want to touch on in terms of topics is the management. And device management, fundamentally, actually, when you think about it, is the bread and butter of the BMW service. And it has a number of key features built into it. But firstly, we're not only just looking at device, we are about managing the user as part of a unified strategy. Part of that is license optimization and reporting, so to scale up and down as we touched on a bit earlier. Device freedom and application freedom, I think, is a really, really important part. And it's something that Core and Bytes have worked together on to ensure how we supply devices, the types of devices we supply, is as flexible as possible. And I think for us, that's one of the key challenges around some of the other offerings, is not everybody is in a greenfield scenario or is able to kind of try out hundreds of devices. So the freedom to pick the type of device and not be restricted to a small subset of manufacturers or device types is a key part. We want to be as open as flexible as possible, and also within the management environment to integrate with other management applications where we need to. The delivery mechanism is also something that we need to make sure we've got flexibility. So our base service offers the ability to provide devices on a both physical and virtual basis, or a hybrid. And there's so many scenarios where hybrid, virtual and physical makes sense. We've had an unusual one actually quite recently with a customer where we provided a virtual environment as part of the onboarding process. So as the customer is rapidly scaling up new users, they immediately became they were provided with virtual devices, and as physical devices were shipped or during any downtime issues, once the physical device arrived, we then seamlessly transitioned from virtual to physical. So there's a number of hybrid scenarios that are supported, and I think the key thing here is flexibility. Work out the best way to get a user operational quickly and efficiently, and achieve that as part of the service. So 2 points worth reiterating that maybe we touched on a wee bit earlier. A key tenet to the BMW service is ensuring that you're always up to date, and managing evergreen is something we hear time and time again is a significant problem. BMW takes care of that, makes sure that we can do that as part of the service. And finally, we've touched on earlier in terms of liberating IT, and you know, ensuring that less time is spent on frankly mundane, repeatable issues which we can solve behind the scenes, and really focusing IT in terms of innovating line of business and supporting some of the explosion we're seeing in terms of things like shadow IT, so being able to manage and work with the business to achieve those kind of outcomes for the business, as opposed to focusing in on BAU type activity. And when we look at a day in the life type scenario of device management, one of the prevailing principles of the BMW service, and it's a principle we as a team stand by, is if a user is calling us, we are potentially behind the curve. You know, it was something that we potentially could have remediated in advance. So BMW uses a number of mechanisms, intelligent agents and so on, to do proactive remediations. So it uses a set of baseline proactive scripts, and we have a whole set of scripts that we come with, but we also work with our customers on bespoke applications, bespoke line of business apps. For example, we're working with a financial services company that have an ERP system. We've identified a number of the fundamentally flaky, for want of a better word, services. We have a set of remediation scripts that are monitoring constantly, and where we see issues, we preempt and remediate those issues. So the user is fundamentally not getting interrupted. At most, they get a momentary pause on service while we remediate. And probably one of the most important points is increased productivity. But thankfully, we're not getting calls to the help desk to, why is my system crashed again? So one of the key things is, let's try and remediate in advance. Let's use both the technologies built into M365, technologies that we put, scripting that we put as part of the BMW service. The last piece, and I think this is probably the final piece before I hand back to Hannah, I think a key element of our service really is looking at how we work hand in hand with our customers as a single team. Many of our customers have in-house resources, first and second line triaging calls and so on. Many have second line teams, and when we look at third line teams, you know, we see a number of kind of key challenges. In particular, when we look at Microsoft 365 landscape, it's constantly changing and evolving, and it is challenging to stay on top of that strategically. So to support this scenario, BMW provides direct access to our third line and architecture team to support specific issues where that's appropriate, but more importantly, to give strategic advice and guidance on an ongoing basis, and really guide through some of the changes across all of the M365 stack. And finally, where appropriate, to even provide hands-on support as part of a technology rollout, maybe pilots, POCs, direct involvement to guide the team, whether it's implementing information management, labeling, or whatever it might be, that we can bring our experience and guidance to that delivery. And I think it's the fundamental and final comment about the service. It's about becoming a one team, unified approach, BMW and our customers together. So that's kind of a whistle-top tour of some of the key areas that we address. And I'm going to hand over to you just on kind of a couple of final points from us.
Thank you, Damon. So I think, as Peter mentioned in his slides, when it comes to actually justifying looking at desktop at a wider piece, it can be one of the harder challenges, despite the fact that desktop is one of the most fundamental, or the most fundamental kind of entities within your estate. It can be quite hard to get management on board. So what we've worked kind of for the BMW service is to offer a pilot offering. So two elements to this. So first of all, what's included? Well, we're looking at doing a subsample of kind of 50 users. Recommend not just the IT team. Let's get some marketing guys in there, finance guys in there, whether it be kind of a certain department within your organization. One of a 3-month period where, as part of that, we'll configure the Autopilot and the endpoint manager side of things. We'll get the integration between the service desk, so whether it's you'll be emailing our service directly, or if you've got an existing first or second line team, we'll work that out with you. You'll be given a dedicated service manager, and as part of their role, they'll be doing monthly service reviews, but also in the background with the pilot, what we'll work with you is, what does good look like? What are you trying to prove? What are the pain points you have at the moment? We'll actually work to make sure that in those monthly reviews, they're considered, and at the back of it, you'll get a recommendation report on, even if you don't decide to proceed past the pilot, you've actually got what we call a continued service improvement, or CSI report, so you can take that away and kind of deploy them internally. What's the catch? I suppose, what's next steps? So no catch here. The next steps would be a 1-hour call with one of our architects. So at the beginning of the webinar, it was mentioned that there will be a survey to fill out. So as part of that, you can check whether you want to be followed up with or not. I will actually personally be contacting you, so you'll hear from me. But when it comes to actually the cost of the pilot, we're looking at just a fixed cost of 5K. So as Peter said, if you still think that 5K might be a problem, we can look at some other areas. of how we can justify getting that cost over to the business. But yeah, that is everything from us today. Hopefully you got a good overview of the MMD solution, but also the BMW solution. And I suppose over to Q&A where I'll hand back to Bytes.